This podcast is brought to you by the American Enterprise Institute.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share.
Thanks for listening. Here's our show.
What the hell is going on?
What's really going on?
We said, what the hell happened?
You don't have to know what the hell is on it.
They see what's going on. I don't know what's going on. What is going on?
We must find out what is going on.
Hi, I'm Danielle Petka.
And I'm Mark Thiessen.
Welcome to our podcast, What the Hell is Going On? Summer Edition. Mark, what have you read?
Well, we're doing our summer series, What the Hell Should I Read This Summer? And we've got my former White House colleague, Jonathan Horn, who, since leaving the White House, has become a wonderful historian and has written a series of wonderful books. And we've had him on our podcast for, I think, for all of them. He wrote a wonderful book about Robert E. Lee, the man who would not be Washington. He wrote a book called Washington's End, which was the first history of Washington's post-presidency. And now he's written this terrific book about General Jonathan Wainwright, who was the commander in the Philippines who surrendered, actually, when MacArthur fled. Everybody knows Douglas MacArthur. There's been tons of ink spilled about Douglas MacArthur. I know you're not a MacArthur fan, and we'll get into that. But few people know about Jonathan Wainwright. He was the highest ranking. He held, when MacArthur fled, he stayed with the troops. He surrendered to save the lives of his troops, and he became the highest-ranking POW in World War II. Was eventually awarded the Medal of Honor for his heroism, both in defending the Philippines and in his service as a prisoner of war for so long. He underwent horrible torture at the hands of the Japanese. And Jonathan has done this wonderful book telling their stories side by side and bringing a spotlight onto a man who arguably should have deserved that spotlight more than MacArthur, who seemed to crave it.
Right. That's exactly right. The story of Douglas MacArthur is always about Douglas MacArthur. It's never about the troops. It's never about the goals. It's never about the country. It's always about his role. I don't remember who it was, but I think it might have been Eisenhower who said, you can't see the sun and you can't see the moon when Douglas MacArthur is speaking because he is the sun in every one of his tales. But these are opportunities. These are opportunities to talk about things that aren't super political. And I started to tell you and Jonathan before we were on the air. You know how things are shaping for you when you're young. Our colleague Carlin Bowman's husband, some years back now, wrote a book about honor. Jim Bowman's book, which I recommend to everybody, is really good. And he and I talked about this very topic because, as I mentioned to you, my dad, when I was a girl, gave me a copy of The Four Feathers, which is this story, late 19th century, set in the UK, about the UK's colonial battles in the Sudan. And this young man who, from a military family, brought up by his general grandfather, who decides not to join his unit and is called a coward and is dumped by his fiancée and called a coward by his friends and his military compatriots. And it is the story about how they deliver four feathers to him as a mark of his cowardice and how he spends his time returning those feathers to them. So it's a story about, the critical importance of honor. And to me, this is just exactly in that vein. It's something that we don't talk about very much anymore. But this, General Wainwright, is truly a man of honor.
Absolutely. And they both MacArthur and Wainwright received the Medal of Honor, which is the nation's highest military honor. And ironically, I understand why Jonathan was drawn to this story, because both Jonathan and I wrote speeches awarding the Medal of Honor to various people when we were White House speechwriters together in the Bush administration. And so we learned through that research and that writing the just enormous heroism that our Medal of Honor recipients go through. But ironically, MacArthur's Medal of Honor is won as a political Medal of Honor. It was done for political purposes, not for his actual heroism and his escape. And General Marshall wanted to give the Medal of Honor to Wainwright as well, and MacArthur vetoed it and tried to stop him because he didn't want Wainwright to get the Medal of Honor. He got it eventually anyway, but it's this story of a man who has not seen the spotlight of history, who did in every situation, did the honorable thing, never criticized MacArthur, was loyal to MacArthur to the end. MacArthur was not loyal to him. And now Wainwright's getting his day in the sun, and I think it's just wonderful.
I do too. It's funny though what this book reminded me about, because MacArthur is a very modern figure, right? One of the things that we've seen over the last few decades is
Media
the rise
general.
of the Yes, exactly. He's a media general. You're exactly right. And he is more interested in his own narrative than he is in the campaign in which he is a commander. And I feel like this should be mandatory reading for everybody who graduates from our military academies, because this is the lesson to be the Wainwright, right?
Yes.
To be that guy.
Exactly. Be Wainwright, not MacArthur. That's great. Well, why don't we just, neither of us are trained historians. Jonathan Horn is. So why don't we turn to Jonathan?
For folks who don't remember, Jonathan Horn is the author of Washington's and the Robert E. Lee biography, The Man Who Would Not Be Washington, which was a Washington Post bestseller. He's written for everybody. The Post, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the New York Post, the Daily Beast. I could keep going. He's a former White House speechwriter, as Mark said, a presidential speechwriter, and he served under President George W. Bush.
And he was one of our most talented speechwriters, almost straight out of Yale, a kid in his 20s who was writing speeches for the President of the United States, and now has become he's got a niche in bringing in these lost corners of history to life that other historians have overlooked. And so his book is called The Fate of the Generals, MacArthur, Wainwright, and the Epic Battle for the Philippines. Here's our interview. Jonathan, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
So it's so great to have you. We have you on every time you write another fantastic book, and you've done it again. You've got a new book out about two generals in the Philippines, one well-known, Douglas MacArthur, the other less known, Jonathan Wainwright. MacArthur's a household name. Wainwright is not. Is that a historical injustice that you're trying to set right here?
I think that is a historical injustice, and that's very much why I wanted to write this book. I think most Americans have heard those famous words that Douglas MacArthur said when he was ordered out of the Philippines in 1942, "I shall return." But very few people know the story about the general that Douglas MacArthur left behind in the Philippines. His name was Jonathan Wainwright, and he also made a vow, and his vow was to stay with his men and share their fate, even when that meant becoming the highest-ranking American prisoner of war of World War II. And as I was looking at these two stories, it seemed like you couldn't understand one without understanding the other. You couldn't understand the story of the general who vowed to return unless you understood the story of the general who vowed to stay. And there was this opportunity because I discovered there were all these unexplored Wainwright papers that had been deposited in military archives in the more than 40 years since anyone had written a book about General Wainwright. So here was an opportunity to be able to tell his story in a way never before possible, and to put him where I think he belongs, exactly where you said, side by side with Douglas MacArthur.
So can you set the scene for us? So a lot of Americans don't realize that the Philippines were a U.S. colony at the time. Where were we? Lay the scene for us so that we know what's happening here.
Right, and as you put it, that's the key point. Many Americans don't realize that the Philippines were once a colony of America's, and it was Douglas MacArthur's father, a general named Arthur MacArthur, who actually led the very first American troops into the walled city of Manila in 1898 during the Spanish-American War, and saw the American flag raised over them. And he later served as military governor of the Philippines as they were annexed into the United States. And it was from his father that I think Douglas MacArthur learned that the Philippines were the key position to America's future as a Pacific power. But as you look at the Philippines in the years between that and World War II, you realize that military strategists in America realized that we would have a serious problem in the event of war with Japan. It would be very difficult to defend these islands. And if you look at a map of the Pacific, you can see why by the time Japan was able to bring forces to the Philippines, and they would be able to bring large numbers of forces, it would take a much longer time for America to bring reinforcements across the world's largest ocean. And that was going to make any defense of the Philippines very challenging.
So, Jonathan, thank you for writing this book. Unlike Mark, and perhaps unlike you, who probably knows more about this than I do, I think General Wainwright is the more honorable of the two. And the story about how MacArthur conducted himself in the Philippines and his rather ignominious return to the Philippines are both extraordinarily enlightening. Before we start talking about what it all means and what the lessons are for today, dive a little more into the details. So MacArthur has a plan which is not the U.S. military's plan to take the Philippines. He exaggerates the nature of the force that he commands. He then skives out with all of his top people and at the instructions, I'm using air quotes for our listeners, at the instructions of the president, because that's what he wanted for top cover, leaving General Wainwright there. General Wainwright is a far more rules-oriented graduate of West Point than General MacArthur. I suspect General Wainwright probably still had his brim inside his hat, rather than General MacArthur, who spent a lot of time worrying about how he would look most handsome in the next picture that was taken. And so there used to be a during
Danny
World
is
War
seething with contempt for MacArthur.
I'm not a fan. So during World War II, in the newsreels, and also in travelogues that they had, they would have these things where it would say, "And you are there," right? Okay, give us a bit of a blow by blow of how we end up in this place in which MacArthur goes off to be headquartered in Melbourne, Australia, in my mother's high school, and which I'm allowed to pronounce with an Australian accent, Mark. And General Wainwright ends up being the highest-ranking POW in World War II in the Pacific Theater.
Well, so I think, and first of all, you gave a pretty good overview right there. I think the best place to start is, first of all, a little background on General Wainwright. This is a gritty old cavalryman. He had spent some of the formative years of his youth at Fort Custer in Montana, and that is where it sounds like right near the site of Custer's last stand at the Little Bighorn. And all of his life, he was obsessed with horses and the story of Custer and the story of the last stand, never knowing that he would, of course, have to one day make a last stand of his own in the Philippines. So as you said, Douglas MacArthur had a plan to defend the Philippines. And in the months before World War II, he put his plan over the plan that had been worked on for many, many years. And his plan called to defend the Philippines on the coastlines of the island. This is the main island of Luzon. It's the largest and most populated island in the Philippines. And he's going to defend it using Philippine conscripts that he's been in the islands training. So this is a conscript army. And General Wainwright is MacArthur's highest ranking field commander. And very quickly, Wainwright takes a look at these conscripts and he realized they really don't stand any chance in the event of war with Japan. And that's exactly what happens. On December 22nd, 1941, Japanese troops land at Lingayen Gulf in Luzon, and very quickly, MacArthur's plan to defend the beaches falls apart so quickly that they have to revert back to an old plan called War Plan Orange. And under War Plan Orange, instead of trying to defend the full coastline of these many islands, you're just going to try to defend two critical positions. This is the entrance to Manila Bay. And to control Manila Bay, you need to control the Bataan Peninsula and a little tadpole-shaped island off the tip of Bataan called Corregidor. And so it's Wainwright who leads the retreat of forces to Bataan. He pulls off a pretty successful maneuver. This is done under very challenging circumstances. But when he gets to Bataan, of course, there are very difficult conditions awaiting him. And if you actually go to Bataan now, even, you can see what difficult conditions. In some places, the jungle is so thick that even a veteran soldier can completely lose his bearings. It's so thick that 1,000 Japanese soldiers are able to break through the main line of resistance that American forces make across the peninsula and just disappear into the jungle. And so the front really could be anywhere, but the Japanese were never the main trouble in Bataan. The main trouble was food shortages. Very quickly, American forces have to go down to half rations and then down to quarter rations. That's about 1,000 calories a day. That's not enough to live comfortably in bed all day, to say nothing of trying to fight in foxholes. And so it's under these conditions that actually Wainwright, the old cavalryman, has to make the very difficult decision to have the horses of his favorite unit, the 26th Cavalry, provide one last service to his army and be eaten by them. And as Wainwright will put it, Bataan was a hopeless hell, and it really was.
So you mentioned the Operation Orange, was it called?
War Plan Orange.
War Plan Orange. So the original plan, they recognized that they couldn't defend forward, and so it was almost like a Dunkirk type situation where you'd pull back and have an evacuation. And MacArthur overrules that and tries to defend forward. And then they have to fall back on the original plan, but all the rations get captured by the Japanese, as I understand it. So MacArthur was trying to have D-Day when what they needed was Dunkirk, and that would have been, if they had kept the original plan, it could have been successful. No.
In my opinion, I don't think the original plan would have been successful either, in fairness to MacArthur. They would have been better off because, as you say, the food that had been dispersed to the outskirts of Luzon would have been brought to Bataan on day one. And so the forces in Bataan would have had more to eat. At the same time, the plan never really added up. At best, strategists who were looking at War Plan Orange in the years before World War II thought that those men could hold out on Bataan for about maybe 6 months at most. And they knew it was going to take a lot longer for reinforcements from the United States to make it across the Pacific Ocean. And that was before the damage wrought at Pearl Harbor, which made it even all much harder to do that. So the math never really added up. In a sense, what you have is that the United States had made this commitment to being a great power by taking a colony on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, but it wasn't willing to make the investments necessary to defend that colony. And as a result, we end up with War Plan Orange, which is better than MacArthur's plan, but still not really a feasible plan for defending the Philippines.
Talk a little bit about the Philippines in the context of the Pacific Campaign, because, especially, we're talking about now more than 80 years later, a lot of people know the headlines from World War II if they know anything, but they don't, they know Pearl Harbor and they know we nuked, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Everything in between, whether it's Leyte Gulf or Corregidor, or contextualize the Philippines in the war for the United States in the Pacific War. How important is it? Is it important at all? What's the story?
Well, first of all, it's vitally important. This is where America suffers its greatest defeat of World War II. Your audience has heard about Pearl Harbor, but on April 9th, 1942, this is after Douglas MacArthur has been ordered out of the Philippines by President Roosevelt. It's in the Philippines, on Bataan, that we have the largest surrender of American forces in history. This is nearly 80,000 United States forces, both Americans and Filipinos, fighting together under the American flag, who surrender on Bataan Peninsula. And of course, the aftermath of that is the famous Bataan Death March. Wainwright will hold out for another month on this tadpole-shaped island of Corregidor. And it's there that eventually that he makes this vow that he is going to stay in the Philippines. You've heard MacArthur's vow to return to the islands, but it's Wainwright who makes this other vow on April 2nd, 1942. He writes in his diary that he can sort of see where this is headed, but he knows there are going to be people who encourage him to try to escape as well. In fact, he had that option. His command encompassed the full Philippines. He could have moved it to one of the lower islands, and from there he could have hopped on a B-17 and maybe gotten to Australia. But he writes in his diary that no other course of action would be honorable but to share the fate of his garrison on Corregidor. And he holds to that promise, even as the Japanese bring their big guns down to the tip of Bataan and put Corregidor under 24/7 artillery assault. He's in this tunnel that's the command post, and it's a big bomb shelter called the Malinta Tunnel, and he holds to that promise even as dust pours down from the walls and the water system breaks, and he knows the Japanese are planning to make their main landing, and the last submarine departs from Corregidor, and he still sticks to that promise because of those words he wrote in his diary: no other course of action would be honorable.
I want to talk about this question of honor and the choices and the two different paths that are sort of hewed by these two rather different people. But just stay with the Philippines again for a second. Taking back the Philippines ends up being one of the most important things to the United States prior to the Battle of Japan. Why is it so pivotal? Because I don't think you can understand either of these men's choices or judge them unless you understand quite how critically important this is. So talk a little bit about that.
Right, and so MacArthur is called out of the Philippines in March 1942, and gets to your question, because when he gets to the safety of Australia, he makes that famous vow, I shall return. And people always say, why didn't he say we shall return? Well, it would have made no sense to say we shall return, because American forces, as I told you, were still fighting in the Philippines. It was MacArthur who had been called out. And that vow, I think it's difficult to overstate how that vow shapes the course of the war in the Pacific. There are many who think that returning to the Philippines is a detour from the main objective of defeating Japan. But MacArthur never sees it that way. He sees it that the Philippines were American soil. We had been forced out at the point of a bayonet, and he felt we had to return the same way. And he really does bend the course of the war in a way that I don't think any other general in American history perhaps could have. And if you look at it, and the Pacific is a war, but we never really have unity of command. General Nimitz is advancing on one axis, General MacArthur is advancing on another axis. And it is in the Philippines where these two axes are going to meet. And they're even in the final months, as MacArthur is nearing his return, there are still discussions in Washington about whether the Philippines should be bypassed. And there's this famous meeting between MacArthur, Nimitz, and Roosevelt and Pearl Harbor, where MacArthur really does suggest to Roosevelt that the American people will never forgive you unless you make this return to the Philippines, unless you let me return to the Philippines. And there's actually this letter from George Marshall to MacArthur around this time where he says, we all have to stay focused on the great objective of this war. And then he has to add a clause which says, which is defeating Japan, because he knew that was never MacArthur's chief objective. MacArthur's chief objective in this war was to get back to the Philippines. And some of it is MacArthur's own bond to the islands. These are the islands that his father brought into the American empire. These are the islands that he considered his home, where his son had been born, where he wooed the woman who would become his wife, Jean. And these are the islands that he felt he had responsibility to defend on the eve of World War II. And of course, we've had probably the greatest military failure in the history of the United States.
So MacArthur escapes, gets to Melbourne. Wainwright stays and is taken prisoner and suffers horrible torture, and I would love to hear you tell the story of that. But then MacArthur is awarded the most unusual Medal of Honor in American history, right, for escaping the Philippines, and it seems like it was a very political decision, because there was a fear that his departure from the Philippines and what the tragedy over there would sully America's reputation in the world, and so giving him the Medal of Honor was almost a political Medal of Honor to make a political statement about him. And then Marshall wanted to give it to Wainwright too, and MacArthur vetoes it. The man who made the more cowardly choice vetoes the medal for the man who made the braver choice and the more honorable choice. Tell this story, how this all played out.
That's exactly what happens. Of course, it is Roosevelt who technically orders MacArthur to leave, but there's this concern about how it's going to look to the enemy. And Roosevelt's very concerned about this, about Japanese propaganda, about the captain deserting the sinking ship. And so to offset enemy propaganda, George Marshall and Franklin Roosevelt essentially decide to make America's most revered military medal into a form of propaganda itself, to award it to General MacArthur. And there really are no good grounds. Even George Marshall admits there's really no real substantive argument for having given this medal, but it is presented to MacArthur after he reaches the safety of Australia for abandoning his army. Of course, Mark, as you know, the Medal of Honor, I mean, we were involved with some of these stories at the White House. This is reserved for soldiers who go above and beyond the call of duty and face unimaginable danger. And so Marshall then proposes, after Wainwright has surrendered in the Philippines and become a prisoner, to award the medal to Wainwright. And he doesn't expect that General MacArthur in Australia will have any objections, but MacArthur does have some objections, and he essentially, as you said, blackballs the nomination. He says, if you proceed with this, you will force me to go public with revelations damaging to General Wainwright. And I think as you read that line, you come to the conclusion that MacArthur is prepared to basically say General Wainwright was an alcoholic and ruin his reputation that way. And I think what MacArthur really is furious about is that Wainwright has made the decision to surrender the full Philippine Islands, not just Corregidor. And of course, Wainwright didn't want to do that, but the Japanese would not accept his surrender otherwise. And he realized that they were going to massacre 13,000 people, including female nurses and wounded soldiers in the Corregidor Tunnel, unless he did it. And I think for MacArthur, it went beyond that. It was also, for him, the Medal of Honor always conjured images of his father during the Civil War, riding to the top, leading his regiment to the top of Missionary Ridge, carrying the flag to the top of Missionary Ridge in 1863 in one of the great Civil War charges. And the idea that the Medal of Honor would go to a soldier who had stayed to see the flag lowered was sort of incomprehensible to MacArthur. And so he does blackball the nomination, and its general marshal has to basically put the entire file in a folder labeled super secret until the end of the war, when they revisit it, and Harry Truman will make the decision to award Wainwright the Medal of Honor after he returns home from his terrible ordeal as a prisoner of war, which I know which we should probably say a word about if we get a chance.
Let's do that, but also I want to stay on this theme of the relationship between the two men, that Wainwright was actually on the USS Missouri for the Japanese surrender, but not at MacArthur's invitation. He didn't want him there. He was, I mean, stunning. I mean, it seems like Wainwright was a constant reminder to him of his failure of courage. Did MacArthur know that he really should have stayed, but that he made the decision and sort of Wainwright did what he should have done? Or was, for political reasons, or just felt his presence almost seemed like a reminder of his inadequacy?
So what's interesting is Wainwright thinks that he's on the USS Missouri because of MacArthur. The invitation will come from MacArthur, but it's actually George Marshall in Washington who instigates this, and he tells MacArthur that people in the United States will expect to see General Wainwright on the Missouri. And Wainwright, just to give you a sense of what kind of man this is, before he accepts, he says, I'll go to the Missouri, but I want my 2 aides and my chief of staff, who were both with me for the terrible moment when I had to surrender Corregidor, that humiliating moment, I want them to be with me on the USS Missouri. And of course, this is a ship that everybody wants to be on in September 1945. This is where you'd want to be. And Wainwright makes sure that those men go with him. And that just shows you what kind of loyal general you're dealing with in that sense. And as for MacArthur, he always told the story that he obeyed the order to leave the Philippines because he believed that awaiting him in Australia were forces that he could immediately return to the Philippines with and just turn around and save the islands. And of course, that story is very hard to believe because he should have known better. He knew the Navy was unwilling to break the blockade the Japanese had made around the Philippines in 1942. The other reason MacArthur gives that for obeying the order is he would have been court-martialed had he not obeyed because the order had come from Franklin Roosevelt. Now, I think that's extremely unlikely because political circumstances were very high in the mind of people in Washington who were ordering MacArthur out. And if they were nervous about how it looked to have the highest ranking American called out of the Philippines, can you imagine how it would have looked to court-martial MacArthur for having refused to leave the Philippines because he refused to leave his men? So I think that argument is also very unlikely. But he does accept this order and he does go. And the reason it's given is because, to be honest, MacArthur has become a symbol of hope for people in the United States. All around the Pacific in 1942, if you look at the situation, the Japanese are advancing seemingly without opposition. And only in the Philippines can Americans find the evidence that they're fighting back. And that fight has become synonymous with the name Douglas MacArthur. And if you're curious why, it's because MacArthur had control of the only means of communication with the outside world, the radio. And the communiques he issued tended to mention only one person, Douglas MacArthur.
So I want to talk about General Wainwright's experiences as a prisoner of the Japanese, but I want to get one last plug-in for my Douglas MacArthur hate fest, which is his return to the Philippines. So he returns to the Philippines, a triumphant return, but he doesn't return where he says he's going to return, correct? He's supposed to return in one place, orders a bunch of troops to liberate the airstrip, and then decides he doesn't really want to land there and land somewhere else. and the entire campaign that he ordered wasn't even necessary. So it wasn't like he had learned a lesson over the previous 2 years, was it?
Well, so what happens is the American forces find that there's this opportunity to land. They always assume they were going to have to go to Mindanao first, which is the southern island, the southern large island in the Philippine chain. And they find out there's this opportunity. There's this sort of this hollow area in the middle of the islands called the Visayas. And it's there that MacArthur makes his famous return. But you're right, intelligence problems continue to plague MacArthur even after he's returned to the Philippines. And I think the most notable example is the Battle of Manila. As MacArthur makes another landing in Luzon, he's headed to Manila, and he's certain the Japanese are not going to make a final stand in the city of Manila, that they're going to fight somewhere else. And because he himself had ordered Manila to be an open city in 1941 rather than risk its destruction by war. And he assumes the Japanese are going to make the same decision. But of course, the Japanese make a different decision. They fight block by block for the city of Manila, and the city is destroyed by the Japanese in really one of the worst atrocities of World War II. This is completely destruction of the city. 100,000 civilians are killed because the Japanese basically destroy anything they think can be of help to the Americans, and that includes the Filipino population, because the Filipinos stayed very loyal to the United States throughout the war, and the Japanese take vengeance against them and just carry out unimaginably terrible atrocities. And so that's the great irony of Douglas MacArthur's return to the Philippines. The city he loved, the city he called home, is destroyed in a sense by his return. Now, it's important to say on a moral level, the responsibility for that is with the Japanese. It really is one of the worst crimes of World War II, but it's consistent with the way the Japanese fought wars. They did not believe in surrender, and they did fight to the very last man. And to set up the question about General Wainwright, that goes a lot toward explaining the way they treat Allied prisoners of war, because they don't believe in surrender, so they have no respect at all for prisoners of war.
So let's talk a little bit about his experience as a prisoner of war. And, I did a lot of research on Japanese treatment of prisoner of war when I was writing my book about the CIA interrogation program, because we always heard, the waterboarding, the Japanese did waterboarding. It's the same kind of techniques that the Japanese used on American prisoners that we were now using. And I went and did some research on it. And what the Japanese version of waterboarding is they would starve prisoners of war, and then they would feed them uncooked rice, and then pump their stomachs with water so that the rice would expand and blow up their internal organs like that. That's the kind of torture, premeditated torture, that the Japanese were doing. They obviously didn't do that to Wainwright, or he would have not have survived. But talk to us a little bit about the kind of experience that Wainwright and the other POWs had at the hands of the Japanese.
Right, and so the Japanese cruelty was almost casual in the way they treated prisoners of war. And of course, Wainwright got slightly better treatment than those who surrendered in Bataan, because he was the highest ranking American prisoner of war. But to hear about the cruelty he experienced makes you realize what terrible conditions everyone experienced. He was taken prisoner. They moved him around from the Philippines to various different camps in Taiwan, where they engaged in what essentially Wainwright will describe as systematic starvation. He is beaten. This is a lieutenant general being beaten by Japanese privates. He is cut off from the outside world, and perhaps this is the worst form of torture he faces, because he is so anxious about what people back home in the United States will think about this decision that he made to surrender for the sake of his men, to save their lives. And he's worried about what people will think, and he's cut off from the outside world. It's not until 1944 that he receives a letter from his wife, and he eventually ends up all the way in Manchuria, where he faces negative 49-degree temperatures. His body is breaking down. This is in 1945. We think, you're almost at the end of the war. You're there. But he had no idea the war was almost over. He thought it could last for another 2 years. And there's this one entry in his diary where he writes, he thinks he's not going to make it. He can't get out of what passes for a bed in these prisons. And he writes, "I'm going to fight for life just as I fought for life in the Philippines. No one called me yellow then, and no one's going to call me yellow now." And I think that entry shows you what kind of man you're dealing with in General Wainwright.
I've actually been to northern Manchuria in the winter. and experience that cold. And there's actually it's a propaganda museum, but the Chinese actually have a museum of the Japanese occupation in northern Manchuria where they show you all the torture and all the experiments they did on the Chinese and everything like that. I was in Harbin for the Harbin Ice Festival, and it's the coldest place I've ever been in my entire life. And I can't imagine. And I was there, staying in a nice hotel and with warm boot warmers and all the rest of it. I can't imagine being a prisoner of war in northern Manchuria, what that would have been like.
Yeah, and they cut off heat to the barracks in as spring is coming. And of course, in Manchuria, as you know, that's not actually it's still well below freezing, and they're cutting off heat, and the prisoners don't have real warm clothing. So you can imagine the terrible suffering and why their bodies are breaking down. But Wainwright does make this vow to fight for life, and he does get through this experience, and he does survive. And actually, if you're curious, there's an OSS operation that is they come in, they're airdropped into Manchuria to look for Wainwright because George Marshall was so eager to get Wainwright out of there, because there's a concern when the war is over what the Japanese will do to the Americans they're still holding prisoner.
Interesting. So let's talk about their choices. MacArthur is obviously a unique individual, not quite as bad as Danny Putnam and distinguished himself in a very serious way during World War I, which is how he ends up climbing the ranks so quickly, less in the interwar years where he distinguishes himself not at all. But nonetheless, you look at the two of them and you see one man whose obsession is with himself, his own narrative, and victory, to be sure, for the United States, which is important because that's the right obsession for a military leader. And you see another man who's really quiet, for whom doing the honorable thing and saving lives is critical. How do they, this isn't a psychology show, but how do they end up on these different paths?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think for Wainwright, you have to understand there's this diary entry he makes during his time as a prisoner of war, and we're lucky that his diaries survive this experience, and those are some of the papers that made it possible for me to write this book. He has an entry, and he's writing rules to help give advice to younger officers who are in prison with him. And one of the rules is never criticize your commanding officer. And that gives you a lot of insight into Wainwright, because in the years after Wainwright comes out of the prison, people always really want to know, what do you really think about Douglas MacArthur? And that word really is important, because when asked, Wainwright will always give the same answer. MacArthur is one of the three best generals in American history. And the other two, if you're curious, are Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee. This is Wainwright's opinion. Even Wainwright's own son will concede that no one will ever know what his father really thought about General MacArthur, because MacArthur was Wainwright's commanding officer. And I think, you're talking about duty, respect for the chain of command. You look at that moment when Wainwright is in the Malinta Tunnel and the Japanese are outside and preparing to bring their tanks in. The easier decision would have been to die, I think, for Wainwright in that moment, to go down in a glorious death. And I think that's hard for modern audiences to understand, but that would have been the easier choice rather than becoming a prisoner of war. But Wainwright knew that someone was going to have to lead these men into prison, and he looked at the female nurses who were with him in that tunnel, who he considered brave as any pioneers in American history, and the wounded soldiers who couldn't get up off their beds in the hospital laterals of the Malinta Tunnel. And he realized that someone had to do this, and it was going to be him, and no other course of action would be honorable.
And ultimately, he ends up, when MacArthur runs for president, he ends up doing the nomination speech. What can I say, right? I mean, no further insight into that. It's just, this is what you do for your commanding general kind of thing.
Wainwright never was much of a politician, I would say. He had actually considered running as a Democrat for Texas Senate before. So you can see how strange it is. A few months afterward, he ends up at the Republican convention seconding a nomination for Douglas MacArthur and says he's the leading expert in preparedness. And of course, he's overseeing this fiasco in the Philippines. But again, this is a man who deeply believes in the chain of command and staying loyal. And, he does have a complex relationship to MacArthur. He was at West Point at the same time as MacArthur. He was When he showed up, MacArthur was already in his final year and already putting together the great MacArthur legend that we're still here debating today.
It seems like he was loyal to MacArthur, and MacArthur was not loyal to him, which is, I always despise people who have no downward loyalty, both in politics and military life. Wainwright does eventually get the Medal of Honor. So tell us that story and tell us about his life after the war.
So as you said, Wainwright shows up on the USS Missouri by George Marshall's recommendation, and then he returns to the United States, where he's reunited with his wife. There's a parade for him in Washington, D.C., and there's one final stop to make at the White House, where President Truman is waiting to give Wainwright, our nation's highest military award, the Medal of Honor. And I told you that no one ever really knew what Wainwright would say about MacArthur, but Harry Truman never had any problem saying what he thought about about Douglas MacArthur. He made that perfectly clear, and this is well before the Korean War, when Truman and MacArthur had their famous conflict. As early as the end of World War II, we have Truman in his notes writing things like, "My predecessor removed the wrong general from the Philippines." He said if Franklin Roosevelt had given the order to remove Wainwright instead of MacArthur, we would have had a real fighting general instead of a prima donna and a stuffed shirt. These are the words that Harry Truman is using to describe Douglas MacArthur, and those are tough words. But in fairness, I think Franklin Roosevelt had realized that we had needed two very different generals in March 1942. He knew we needed a general for the front lines, and we needed a general for the headlines. And I don't think that Douglas MacArthur could have done what General Wainwright did. No general as self-centered and certain of his place in history as Douglas MacArthur could have made the sacrifice Wainwright did, not to die a glorious death. And I think MacArthur would have been willing to die, in fairness, but he would not have been willing to become a prisoner of war and face that humiliation that General Wainwright faced for the next couple of years.
And so what happened to him after? He comes home, there's a parade, he gets the Medal of Honor. Tell us a little bit about his post-war life.
Well, it's not an entirely happy story. He comes home, he's reunited with his wife, but he discovers that his wife, Adele, has become addicted to alcohol and sedatives during his absence. And that is how she has endured the years of months of not knowing where her husband is. And he has to make the very difficult decision, if you can believe it, to have her committed. And,
oh my goodness.
She goes through electroshock therapy, and it is a very difficult story. Several times they try to reunite, and she always relapses and has to be committed again. And so they do not end up together. And it's especially painful as you look at Wainwright's diary, because one of the things that's keeping him going is the thought that he can be reunited with his dear Adele. And he's cheated of that. And I think it's a reminder that when we're talking about prisoners of war, we remember the terrible ordeal they go through, but we sometimes forget about the terrible ordeal that their families go through. And unfortunately, General Wainwright's family, and especially his wife, is a good example of the terrible cost people on the home front pay too.
That's a terrific, terrific subject, a terrific, terrific book. Jonathan, thank you for joining us and for talking about it. And thank you for writing it. It was just outstanding. So everybody should read it. Everybody should enjoy it as much as we have. And next book, we'll have you back next summer. What are you writing next?
I'm open to ideas. Still thinking about it.
Well,
Give me a few years to be back.
One of the things you've done is you've found the niches of history that have been neglected by historians and brought them to life, and you found this figure that I didn't know much about Wainwright until you've wrote this book, and so you've resurrected him, the man who deserved the accolades. You've given him the spotlight that he deserves, and I think that's just so cool. So thank you for doing that. It's and you do that with all your books in ways, telling the stories that the rest of historians have neglected, and I love that niche you've made for yourself and as a historian.
Well, thanks so much, and thanks so much for having me on to talk about General MacArthur and General Wainwright. I really appreciate it.
All right, take care, Jonathan. Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in touch with the show by emailing us at whatthehell@aei.org.
Or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at @dpletka.
And I'm at Mark Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.